harsh winter of 1798, 12-year-old Mercy Harrow vanished into the unforgiving wilderness of Kentucky, leaving behind nothing but blood-stained clothing and a diary filled with chilling confessions that have haunted historians for over 2 centuries. Though many dismissed her writings as the fevered imaginings of a frightened girl, newly uncovered government records now suggest a far more horrifying truth, that Mercy's disappearance was part of a calculated string of murders targeting families traveling westward. Her diary doesn't just recount the sorrow of a child bride, it unveils what may have been a systematic massacre that claimed the lives of at least 47 pioneer families along the notorious Wilderness Trail. What makes her story even more disturbing is that Mercy may not have been a passive victim at all. She was likely the only living witness to one of the deadliest killing sprees in early American history, trapped in a nightmare where her husband was the architect of it all. Before we unravel her tragic tale and the monstrous secrets buried along Kentucky's treacherous trails, take a moment to subscribe and share where you're listening from. Because this case proves that evil often wears a familiar face, and it can emerge in the very places we call home. It all began not with a crime, but with what seemed like an innocent romance. In 1798, Kentucky was still a wild, dangerous land, promising fertile ground and fresh starts, but demanding everything in return. Families journeyed through the Cumberland Gap, along narrow paths cut into forests and gorges where countless travelers vanished. The government blamed hostile raids, wild animals, or misadventure because the wilderness offered no second chances. In remote Cumberland County, law was nearly non-existent, with courthouses days away and magistrates reluctant to leave established settlements. It was a place where screams could be swallowed by the woods and murderers could operate freely. Into this world came Mercy Harrow, only 11 when she arrived in the fall of 1797, recently orphaned by a fever that claimed her parents mid-journey from Virginia. Taken in by the Caldwell family, distant relatives who agreed to care for her until a permanent home could be found, Mercy seemed destined to slip into obscurity. But her fate changed the night Daniel Crenshaw stepped into their camp. A 19-year-old with a confident manner and polished speech, Daniel claimed to be a seasoned guide with a perfect record of navigating families through the dangerous frontier. The Caldwells welcomed him as a godsend, grateful for a protector to lead them through the perilous final leg of their journey. What they didn't know was that Daniel wasn't a guide at all. He had spent 3 years in the wilderness, honing a method of murder so flawless that no one suspected a thing. The families he claimed were lost to raids had in fact died by his hand, their possessions funding an increasingly sophisticated scheme. Mercy noticed Daniel watching her on the second evening. While the others focused on food and travel plans, his eyes lingered on her in ways she couldn't quite understand. Too young to know the full meaning of attraction, she still felt something stir when he spoke to her. At the stream, he complimented her intelligence, noting how unusual it was to find a girl on the frontier who could read and write. She responded shyly, echoing her mother's words about education being a lasting treasure. Daniel's interest seemed kind, almost gentle, and in a world where she'd been treated as an inconvenience, his attention felt like hope. He sought her out, asked about her thoughts and books, made her feel seen. The Caldwells, focused on survival and eager to make progress before winter set in, failed to notice the quiet intimacy growing between them. They missed how Mercy's eyes lit up when he spoke, or how she started caring more about her appearance. Daniel's charm disguised the monster beneath. Mercy was being drawn into something she couldn't possibly comprehend, a deadly romance that would lead her not to love, but to the heart of one of the darkest crimes in the history of the American frontier. On the night of October 23, 1797, Daniel Crenshaw made his move, not against the Caldwells, but against Mercy Harrow's heart. She was sitting alone, writing in the journal her mother had given her, when Daniel joined her on the fallen log. "I've been thinking," he began gently. "The Caldwells plan to leave you with the mission in Lexington, don't they?" Mercy nodded, the weight of that reality settling over her again. She had dreaded being left behind. Daniel leaned closer, his voice lowering into a conspiratorial tone. "That's no life for a girl like you. Those mission women will crush your spirit, turn you into another obedient frontier wife, churning out babies for a man who can't even spell his own name." Her voice was small when she replied, "What choice do I have? I have no family, no money, nowhere else to go." Daniel waited a beat before delivering the line that would change everything. "You could come with me." What followed was every bit the fantasy of a lonely, intelligent 11-year-old girl desperate for belonging. He described a life of travel, partnership, and purpose, where she would use her talents to help him guide families across the wilderness. Her literacy would be invaluable for tracking weather patterns, mapping routes, and recording vital information. "You're more mature than most girls your age," he told her, slipping her hand into his. "You deserve more than a life wasted in someone else's kitchen." What Mercy couldn't detect behind the warmth in his voice was the predatory calculation. Daniel had chosen her not out of love, but necessity. She was young enough to control, smart enough to serve his needs, and alone enough to cling to the illusion of safety he offered. Her diary entries would later reveal that Daniel had selected her with the precision of a man building an operation, not a marriage. 3 days later, a traveling preacher, if he was one at all, officiated their crude wedding ceremony. The Caldwells, relieved of the burden of escorting her to Lexington, gave their approval without hesitation and even gifted supplies to the newlyweds. On that crisp autumn morning, Mercy Harrow became Mercy Crenshaw, believing she was the luckiest girl in Kentucky. Within 2 months, she would be pregnant. Within 6, she would uncover the truth. And within 8, she would be dead, leaving behind a diary that exposed one of the most terrifying killing operations in frontier history. At first, married life felt like a dream. Daniel built a cabin deep in a secluded valley 15 miles off the wilderness trail, shielded by thick oaks and rocky outcroppings. It was isolated but accessible, perfect, he said, for their guide business. Mercy embraced her new role with innocent enthusiasm, filling pages with notes on snowpack levels, game movement, and passable routes. Daniel praised her work often, calling her sharp, reliable, and essential. When spring comes, he told her, "We'll be the best guide service out here. We'll choose only the best-paying families." Evenings by the fire were filled with books Daniel claimed to have brought from college in Philadelphia: Shakespeare, the Bible, early American philosophy. For a girl who feared a future without learning, it was bliss. When she discovered her pregnancy in December, her joy was complete. Daniel seemed genuinely supportive, caring for her through morning sickness, soothing her sore feet, and filling her head with dreams of the family they would raise together. But cracks began to show as winter faded. Daniel often vanished for days, claiming he was scouting new routes, yet he never let Mercy join him despite her skill. He always returned with supplies, sometimes basics, sometimes luxuries like sugar or coffee, but his stories about how he acquired them were inconsistent. "A merchant's wagon broke down," he'd say, or "I traded with a Cherokee chief," but the details rarely added up. Mercy, still blissfully in love and distracted by her pregnancy, brushed the doubts aside. Then in April of 1798, as the snow melted and travel resumed, their first clients arrived, a family from North Carolina named the Harmons, with 3 children and dreams of settling near Lexington. They were the kind of travelers Daniel had described as ideal, modestly wealthy, seeking guidance, vulnerable. Mercy was eager to finally live out the purpose he'd promised her, but Daniel's behavior during the Harmons' stay unsettled her. He kept to himself with Mr. Harmon for hours, pressing him for details: where they were going, what they carried, how much they could afford. It wasn't the friendly curiosity of a helpful guide. It was the meticulous probing of someone plotting something else entirely. And Mercy, though still blind to the full horror ahead, began to feel the first stirrings of unease. The dream was starting to crack. The nightmare was waking. Daniel's control over Mercy deepened during the Harmons' stay, cloaked in the language of concern. He insisted she remain in the cabin, claiming that her advanced pregnancy made it inappropriate for her to be seen too often by male clients. "I'm protecting your reputation," he explained when she protested. "Frontier people can be suspicious. A man with a young wife might be seen as reckless." It sounded reasonable, yet something in his demeanor, protective but dismissive, left her uneasy. From the window, she watched him walk the Harmons down the trail, his posture too alert, too engaged. When he returned alone 2 days later, claiming the family had met another group and decided to join them instead, Mercy's unease turned into suspicion. She noticed new items among their belongings: a fine wool shawl, a silver pocket watch, a wooden toy horse. "Did they pay you?" she asked. Daniel's response was curt, his tone sharper than she had ever heard. "Of course, they were generous. Said my expertise was worth every penny." That night, while he slept soundly, Mercy lay awake staring into the darkness. The dream she had embraced so eagerly now trembled at the edges. In her diary she wrote, "Daniel has changed since the Harmons left. I tell myself it's only stress. But if I'm wrong, what then?" Her question would be answered all too soon. In late April, the Pritchards arrived, a wealthy merchant family from Richmond traveling with 2 well-stocked wagons. Mr. Pritchard made no effort to hide the strongbox in one confident in the protection of their hired guide. They had heard of Daniel's reputation and specifically sought him out. From the moment they arrived, Daniel's behavior shifted. He forbade Mercy from being seen at all, claiming she was bedridden with complications. When she protested, insisting she felt fine, his voice turned ice cold. "You will do as I say, Mercy. There are parts of this business you don't need to understand. You follow instructions. Nothing more." It was the first time he spoke to her like a subordinate, and it shook her. She obeyed, but her trust was splintering. Watching from the cabin's window, she observed Daniel with the Pritchards. The conversations were familiar, eerily so. He asked about their money, their route, and most disturbingly, whether anyone in Virginia would be expecting letters or updates. One evening, Mercy overheard Mrs. Pritchard say, "We've no family left in Virginia. That's why we're moving no one to check in with no one waiting." Mercy's stomach turned. That night, she saw Daniel pacing the yard, inspecting the Pritchards' wagons with a disturbing focus. He moved like a man taking inventory. The next morning, he announced he'd be personally guiding the Pritchards through a dangerous stretch of trail known as Devil's Canyon. "Stay here," he told Mercy, gripping her shoulders so hard it hurt. "Don't leave this cabin, no matter what you hear." Mercy nodded, terrified. As she watched the wagons vanish into the woods, dread overtook her. By sunset, that dread turned to horror. The stillness of the forest shattered with a distant gunshot. Then another. Then screaming, piercing, chaotic, abruptly silenced. It lasted barely 10 minutes before fading into an unnatural hush. Mercy spent the night clutching Daniel's rifle, jumping at every crack of twigs. By dawn, when he still hadn't returned, she made a decision. She would go just far enough to find answers. Following the wagon tracks toward Devil's Canyon, Mercy moved slowly, her pregnant body aching, but determined. 2 miles from the cabin, hidden behind a boulder, she found something that froze her in place. A permanent camp. Recent. Not for guests, for him. There were burned-out fire pits, coiled ropes, and scattered items she recognized instantly. A little girl's dress, a brass compass, a wedding ring she'd seen on Mrs. Harmon's finger. But beneath a canvas tarp, Mercy uncovered something far worse. personal mementos, tokens of death. Locks of hair, children's toys, family photographs, and worst of all, final letters clearly written under duress. One trembling in ink read, "To whoever finds this, my name is Margaret Harmon. We were murdered by our guide Daniel Crenshaw on April 12, 1798. He promised us safety. It was a lie. He is not alone." Mercy's world shattered. The man she had married wasn't a guide. He was a predator, a collector of lives, a killer who used her education, her trust, and her love to build a facade of legitimacy. And he wasn't working alone. The illusion was over. Now Mercy Harrow knew the truth, and she had to decide if she would survive long enough to reveal it. As Mercy stood over the evidence of Daniel's crimes, clutching a letter that ended with the words, "Tell our families in North Carolina that we died loving them," the full horror of her reality crashed down. The child stirring in her belly was his Daniel Crenshaw, the charming guide turned mass murderer. Her mind reeled with the realization that he hadn't married her out of love. She was never a partner in a noble mission. She was the record keeper of a slaughter her intelligence weaponized to plan and perfect the logistics of murder. Every detail she had carefully written. Weather conditions, travel patterns, financial observations had been used to orchestrate ambushes. She was a cog in the machinery of death. And now she had to choose continue playing her role or dismantle the operation from within. Before she could decide, hoofbeats cracked through the trees. Mercy barely had time to hide the damning artifacts before Daniel emerged, leading the Pritchard's horses alone. His face was scratched, his clothes muddied, but he wore the smug look of a man who'd completed a lucrative job. "Mercy," he called, masking suspicion with forced warmth. "What are you doing out here? I told you to stay at the cabin." She steadied her voice. "I heard gunshots. I was worried. Where are the Pritchards?" His smile faltered for a breath. "Cherokee raid. Just like I feared. Came out of nowhere. I barely escaped." He lied with the ease of someone who had done it many times before, his story slick and practiced. It was quick, he added, his hand twitching toward the knife at his belt. "That's all we can hope for." As they walked back to the cabin, Mercy's mind moved quickly. The scratches on his face weren't from hiding. They were from struggle. The new supplies too valuable to be left behind. And most damning, the journal she would soon find in her sewing basket. Hidden beneath balls of yarn, it was a murderer's ledger. Neatly written in Daniel's hand were 3 years of death names, destinations, wealth assessments, and methods of execution. The Harmons were shot in a staged raid. The Pritchards were poisoned with hemlock before being finished with blades. And at the bottom of the final page, Mercy read the entry that froze her blood. Wife to be eliminated after childbirth. Infant likely liability. Cause of death complications during labor. Burial in valley near Oak Grove. No follow-up required. The entry was clinical, devoid of feeling. She was a variable in his operation scheduled for removal. The journal also revealed something worse. Daniel wasn't acting alone. At least 6 men worked the Wilderness Trail as part of a coordinated ring, sharing intel on high-value families and ensuring attacks were spaced out to avoid suspicion. They'd accumulated a small fortune from their victims laundered through contacts in New Orleans and Charleston. The body count. At least 47 families, maybe more. As Mercy sat with the ledger trembling in her hands, her baby kicked violently, echoing her fear. Then movement outside. A shadow in the tree line. Someone watching. Not Daniel. Someone else. A silent sentinel, hidden but close, watching their cabin, watching her. When Daniel returned that night, she forced herself to smile, to act as though nothing had changed. But she caught him stealing glances toward the window. subtle nods toward the forest. He was communicating. She wasn't just trapped with a murderer, she was surrounded by a ring of them. Her time was running out. The next morning brought a new kind of dread. A family was approaching their fourth visitors, the Carvers. John Carver, a wealthy lawyer from Charleston, his pregnant wife, 2 young daughters, and a wagon that practically screamed wealth. Mercy's stomach dropped the moment she heard the jingle of gold coins in their luggage. Daniel's eyes sparkled with anticipation. She recognized the look now, not of hospitality, but of hunger. The Carvers were walking into a trap, just like the others. And this time Mercy knew exactly what would happen to them, unless she found a way to stop it. The nightmare had deepened. The cabin in the woods was no longer just the site of a crime. It was the beating heart of a criminal empire. And Mercy Crenshaw, the unwitting bride turned prisoner, was the only person alive who knew all its secrets. And now she had a choice: stay silent and die, or risk everything to expose the truth. Mercy had learned from months of silent observation that Daniel's network of killers was as methodical as it was superstitious. Every movement, every signal was calculated, but so too was their fear. They feared discovery. They feared lawmen. And above all, they feared the wrath of a society that would hang them without trial if their operation was exposed. As her third signal fire lit up the sky, Mercy watched the forest come alive with panic. Shadowy figures who had been lurking at the tree line watchers she had sensed but never seen clearly now moved in frantic patterns, exchanging urgent hand signals just like Daniel had earlier that day. They weren't preparing for an ambush anymore. They were responding to a perceived threat militia in the area. Down at the camp, Daniel burst from the cabin half-dressed and shouting into the darkness, "What's happening?" His voice was sharp, commanding, but touched with fear. He turned to Mercy, who appeared just then from the woods, brushing ash from her skirt. "What did you see?" he demanded. "What's going on out there?" Mercy stared at him for a long, silent moment, then forced a tremor into her voice. "I don't know. I think someone saw us. I think they're lighting signal fires." Daniel's eyes narrowed, flicking toward the tree line where his allies were clearly in disarray. Without answering, he bolted toward the ridge to survey the fires. That was the moment the Carvers needed. In the confusion, Mrs. Carver hustled her family to the waiting horses. Mercy's instructions had been clear. Follow the trail trust. No one don't stop until you reach Boonesboro. By the time Daniel returned to the camp, the Carvers were gone. He exploded with rage, shouting into the woods for his accomplices. But the fires had worked. They had all scattered, unwilling to risk capture. For the first time in his career of killing, Daniel Crenshaw had lost control of the hunt. What happened? He demanded, grabbing Mercy by the arm, his eyes burning with suspicion. "Where are they?" Mercy looked at him, her expression blank. "Maybe they saw the fires and panicked," she said calmly. "You said yourself people get spooked easily out here." Daniel studied her face, then released her, pacing like a caged animal. For the rest of the night he raged, tore through the cabin, and cursed his vanished prey. But he never found the journal pages Mercy had hidden in the hollow of a tree. He never saw the makeshift maps she had drawn for the Carvers. And he never suspected that Mercy was no longer the frightened child bride he had groomed, but the one person who had nearly destroyed his entire operation. The Carvers made it to Boonesboro by week's end, breathless, terrified, and alive. They brought with them Mercy's torn journal pages, Daniel's ledger entries, and first-hand testimony of the horrors along the wilderness trail. Within a month, a detachment of territorial rangers was dispatched to investigate, and by late summer, the manhunt for Daniel Crenshaw and his associates had begun. But by then, Daniel and Mercy were gone. What happened in the final days at the cabin remains a mystery. Some say Daniel discovered Mercy's betrayal and killed her before vanishing into the mountains. Others claim she managed to flee in the night, leaving behind the corpse of her husband and the smoldering ruins of his empire. A few believe she survived, gave birth in secret, and lived under a new name, haunted but free. What is certain, however, is the truth about the wilderness trail finally came to light. Because one young girl, barely 13, pregnant and alone, refused to let evil flourish in silence. As Daniel Crenshaw emerged from the cabin into a chaos of firelight and panic, his carefully constructed world unraveled in seconds. Mercy was gone. The Carver family's horses had vanished. Signal fires blazed in every direction, a clear sign in the network's code that authorities were closing in. But in the darkness, he couldn't tell whether his own men had taken Mercy, or whether she had slipped away on her own. "Mercy!" he roared, the cry echoing through the Kentucky woods like an animal's final threat. "What have you done?" But Mercy had already slipped past him, guiding the Carvers, under cover of night, toward the safety of the main trail. She led them to the creek, pointing to the white stone marker she'd left earlier. "Follow the stream. Turn east at the marker. That'll take you to the trail," she whispered. Mrs. Carver pleaded with her to come, but Mercy refused. "If I disappear now, they'll know you're gone. This buys you time." What followed was a deadly waltz of shadows and breathless silence as Mercy's group crept through the forest. The youngest child, Mary, tripped and cried out a small sound that shattered the silence like glass. Daniel's voice rang out instantly. "Find them! No witnesses." The manhunt began in earnest. Mercy, 7 months pregnant and physically exhausted, led the Carvers deeper into the wilderness, using terrain only she knew intimately. Daniel's men swept through the forest in coordinated patterns, using the hunting calls they had long relied upon for tracking prey, only now their prey was one of their own. Several times the Carvers came dangerously close to being caught, but Mercy's memory of hidden caves and overgrown deer trails saved them. Eventually, fatigue forced them into hiding. Deep in a cave Mercy had once explored, the family huddled in silence while she wrote what she feared would be her final words. In her diary, she recorded not just the names of the killers and their victims, but her own fears and hopes that someone might find her words and bring justice to the dead. She had no way of knowing that her prayers were already being answered. At sunrise, the sound of galloping hooves reached the valley. Captain James Whitfield of the Kentucky Territorial Militia led a column of armed riders into the forest, having followed a trail of rumors, missing persons, and Mercy's signal fires. Travelers had reported seeing too many abandoned camps, too many signs of families who had vanished without trace. Now, the militia had come to investigate. As they descended on the Crenshaw cabin, Mercy faced an impossible decision. If she revealed what she knew, the network might fall, but she risked being prosecuted as an accomplice. Yet that choice was stolen from her when Daniel, realizing his time had run out, came to kill her. Cornering her near the cave, his eyes were wild, his knife drawn. "You've destroyed everything," he hissed. 3 years of planning gone because of a stupid little girl who couldn't stay in her place. Mercy was ready. She had taken one of Daniel's pistols from the cabin, tucked it beneath her skirt in case he found her. As he lunged, she fired. The single shot cracked through the mountains like thunder, drawing the militia straight to her location. When they arrived, they found Daniel dead and Mercy bleeding from wounds sustained during the struggle, her small hands still gripping the weapon that had ended a monster's reign. She died minutes later, but not before whispering, "Tell them. Tell them everything's in the journal." The final pages of that journal, stained with blood and clutched in Mercy's hands, became the cornerstone of the largest criminal investigation in Kentucky's early history. Captain Whitfield, hardened by years of frontier violence, wrote in his report that he had never encountered a killing operation so calculated, so cold. Once they knew where to look, the evidence was overwhelming. Near Devil's Canyon, investigators found the hidden camp Mercy had described. It contained mass graves, dozens of victims buried without markers. They found caches of stolen goods worth over $15,000, an enormous fortune in 1798. But the most shocking discoveries came from Daniel's own journals. His records detailed each kill with horrifying precision. Names, ages, net worth, tactics, maps, coordinated timelines. The killings were not random. They were military in execution. Mrs. Carver's testimony delivered the final blow. Speaking through tears to a packed courthouse in Lexington, she described how a pregnant child just 13 years old had risked everything to save them. Mercy had used her education, her memory, her grit, and her love for a child not yet born to bring down a ring of killers no one even knew existed. Mercy Harrow's story shook the frontier to its core. Her name became a symbol of quiet heroism. Her diary, once dismissed as the musings of a child bride, became a historical artifact, the testimony of one girl who refused to let evil go unchallenged. The aftermath of Mercy Harrow's sacrifice reverberated far beyond the shadowy corners of the Kentucky wilderness. It reshaped the very fabric of frontier justice. When Mrs. Carver took the stand and shared the harrowing details of Mercy's final hours, her words pierced the courtroom like arrows. Jurors wept openly. The gallery erupted in spontaneous applause. For a moment, the lawless brutality of the frontier was silenced by the voice of a grieving mother testifying on behalf of a child hero. A network unmasked. The investigation launched in the wake of Mercy's death uncovered a criminal network far larger and more terrifying than anyone had suspected. Authorities arrested 7 men directly connected to Daniel Crenshaw's operation. But at least 3 others escaped justice, likely fleeing westward into new territories. Under intense interrogation, the captured men confessed to a series of murders spanning 5 years, not 3 as initially believed. The scale was staggering. More than 70 families, an estimated 300-plus people, including children, had vanished into the American wilderness. Their murders had been camouflaged with chilling ingenuity. Some were poisoned with rare plant extracts that mimicked illness. Others were slaughtered in staged Native American raids, their bodies scalped to lend authenticity. Still others were simply disappeared, their corpses hidden or consumed by the wilderness, while their valuables were trafficked through black market networks in Charleston, New Orleans, and beyond. A trial that gripped a nation. The trial of the 7 surviving murderers became one of the most infamous criminal cases in early American history. Families of victims journeyed from as far as New Jersey and South Carolina to witness the proceedings, and newspapers in Boston, Philadelphia, and even London published reports. The courtroom was packed daily. When the verdicts were read, all 7 were sentenced to death. On September 15, 1798, the men were hanged publicly in Lexington before a crowd estimated at over 5,000. But the impact of the trial reached far beyond justice for the dead. A new era of frontier law. Mercy's diary didn't just solve a case, it exposed a systemic failure in frontier governance. The case revealed the shocking lack of communication between territorial jurisdictions, which had allowed organized murderers to exploit legal blind spots. In response, sweeping reforms were enacted. Territorial militias were required to file regular cross-jurisdictional reports. A territorial-wide registry of professional guides was established, requiring all guides to be licensed, bonded, and checked in at official outposts. Coded distress signals were developed for families traveling dangerous routes, with increased militia patrols assigned to known danger zones. The wilderness trail itself was transformed. Guard stations were built at major crossings, and travelers were required to register their passage and confirm safe arrival at pre-established checkpoints. These measures effectively shut down the lawless freedom that had once allowed Daniel's network to thrive. A social awakening. The ripples of Mercy's story didn't stop at legal reform. Her tragic vulnerability, an orphaned girl, manipulated by a predator, moved the hearts of communities across the frontier. Churches, especially those along the Methodist circuit, began organizing support networks for orphaned and vulnerable children. The Lexington Methodist Mission, where Mercy had once been bound, restructured its entire placement process, ensuring that no child would again be assigned to strangers without exhaustive vetting. A legacy carried forward. The Carver family never forgot what they owed Mercy Harrow. John Carver, once a lawyer seeking land, became a key architect of the new legislation protecting frontier travelers. His wife, Sarah Carver, created a fund in Mercy's name to provide education, clothing, and safe housing for orphaned girls throughout the Kentucky Territory. But the most enduring tribute came 3 months after the Carvers' escape, when Sarah Carver gave birth to a daughter. She named the child Mercy in honor of the girl who had died, so that she and her baby could live. Mercy Carver grew up in the light of her namesake's story. Inspired by the bravery of the child who had given everything, she dedicated her life to building schools for frontier children, especially for young girls, especially for orphans. In doing so, she ensured that Mercy Harrow's legacy would never be forgotten. Not as a victim, but as the girl who brought justice to a lawless land and forever changed how America protected its most vulnerable. The place where Mercy Harrow made her final stand, known today as Mercy's Cave, became a solemn and sacred landmark for generations of frontier travelers. Families making the treacherous journey west would pause at the cave not only to rest, but to honor the girl whose courage had saved countless lives. They left flowers, children's toys, locks of hair, and handwritten notes, quiet tributes to a 13-year-old whose death had brought justice to the wilderness. Perhaps most moving were the annual ceremonies held by local Cherokee leaders who had been wrongfully blamed for many of the murders carried out by Daniel Crenshaw's network. They honored Mercy not only for her bravery, but for clearing their people's name through her sacrifice. In an age when rumors had more power than evidence, it was a frightened child, not a soldier, judge, or politician, who gave truth a voice. A hidden crime that reached farther than anyone knew. Modern historians now believe that the official victim count, more than 70 families, is likely only a portion of the true toll. Daniel's network had grown increasingly efficient at identifying vulnerable targets and erasing all signs of their existence. His records, though chillingly thorough, ended abruptly before the group's planned expansion to larger migration routes, including the Great Indian Warpath through Virginia and the Federal Road in the southeastern territories. Had Mercy not acted when she did, the death toll might have been in the thousands. Recovery efforts stretched on for years. Using the coordinates and codes from Daniel's journal, militia and volunteers located dozens of additional burial sites. Remains were unearthed, cataloged, and in many cases finally returned to families who had waited in anguish, not knowing if their loved ones had died or simply disappeared into the chaos of the westward push. Mercy's sacrifice provided more than justice. It provided closure and a web of corruption. As the investigation deepened, it unearthed a dark truth. Daniel's ring had not acted in isolation. Authorities discovered a broader criminal support network, linking the murderers to corrupt merchants and traders in cities like New Orleans, Charleston, and Richmond. These men laundered stolen goods, forged identities, and helped convert blood-stained heirlooms into hard currency. Dozens more were arrested, and the myth of the self-policing honorable frontier was shattered. A forgotten hero. And yet, despite her monumental impact, Mercy Harrow remains largely absent from mainstream American history. Her name does not appear in school textbooks. Her story is not dramatized in films or commemorated in museums. Instead, she survives in the margins, regional archives, old court ledgers, family heirlooms, and the oral traditions of families who remember. Perhaps this omission is no accident. Mercy's story doesn't fit neatly into the romantic image of the American frontier. It exposes uncomfortable truths that the wilderness was not only a place of promise, but also a stage for systemic violence, exploitation, and silence. It reveals that even when communities were small and neighbors were familiar predators, thrived by manipulating trust and targeting the vulnerable. Her tragedy reminds us that evil doesn't always wear a mask, it often smiles, guides you down the trail, and promises you safety. The legacy of a girl who chose justice, but in the heart of that darkness, Mercy Harrow shined. Not because she was trained or powerful or even old enough to vote, but because when it mattered most, she chose to act not for herself, but for others. For the Carver children, for the victims buried in unmarked graves, for every family that never made it west. She could have stayed silent, she could have run, but she didn't. What about you? Do you believe everything about Daniel Crenshaw's operation was revealed? Or do you think there are still secrets buried in the Kentucky wilderness? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts on how such horrors could have gone undetected for so long. And if you were moved by this true tale of terror and bravery, like the video, subscribe and share it with someone who loves chilling mysteries rooted in history. The frontier may be long gone, but the lessons of Mercy Harrow still burn like a warning in the dark. See you in the next story.
Thank you everyone for watching the whole video. Please like and subscribe to watch more good videos.